This is the second video lecture on Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. So I want to pick up with the aim of what she is saying the existentialist ethics is, this ethics which is ambiguous, and through that then we will actually do a kind of recap, a little bit of what was discussed in the first video. So the aim, de Beauvoir says, is to genuinely realize the ambiguity of existence, to will oneself free. That is the prescription. That is what existentialism is saying one ought to do to live a genuine life. So she says, to will freedom and to will to disclose being are one and the same choice. And what that means then is to will that you actively embrace the ambiguity of existence and that you are free to pursue whatever path you would desire in life, is also simultaneously to define yourself, but not to actually define as something which is then closed off and final. Continuing, she says, hence freedom takes a positive and constructive step which causes being to pass to existence in a movement which is constantly surpassed. So again, it's not something final, but it's constantly surpassed, and then freedom is asserted again. And then this is constantly surpassed by the disclosing of being, and then freedom is asserted again, and so on and so forth. And that is because, right, again, one of the foundations of existentialism here is that there is no given meaning. There is no path in life of which you are determined to live. There is nothing that says this is absolutely what the good life is. Instead, we are a being which desires some kind of meaning. This is the part of ourselves which is the rational part in wanting to ensure that all things make sense, that we are assured. There's also a psychological aspect to this, in that we naturally seem to want a state in which we do not question, maybe we could say, like the surroundings around ourselves, right? But instead of kind of feeling at home, a comforting in the way of the child, as she mentioned before in one of the types of bad faith we mentioned. But on the other hand, we are a being which is animal as well, and we are not perfect. We are a being of which we are thrown into the world. And this is part of what makes it ambiguous, that there is, again, this tension. And instead, in wanting to focus on one end of the dilemma here as opposed to another, whether that be then the rational, pure, given, transcendental necessity, or the animalistic, the fluid, the material, wanting to focus on one as opposed to the other, and denying then the other its part of our existence as well, that's part of what it means to then will ourselves badly, or to have bad faith, where we don't actually accept that we have freedom and we deny this. So that would be then, a kind of vice, I guess, if we would say, what are the virtues and what are the vices? Bad faith would then be the kind of vices. So we looked at, of course, the first 6 kinds of bad faith, but there is another kind which seemingly understands maybe the ambiguity, that there is nothing given, there is no pure objective. And that, again, still similar to the nihilist, but a bit different, turns out to also be a case of bad faith. And this is what de Beauvoir calls the critic. So the critic is, so think of, like the person in an art gallery, okay, who is walking around seeking to evaluate art in the gallery, but it's not really placing any kind of a real substantial judgment on any of the art in the gallery of which they are viewing, because they're saying, well, it has to be contextualized, and so you have to understand it this way. So if I was in this context, then this painting would look this way, I'd feel this way about it, but in another context, then I'd feel this other way about it. And there's no real way you can really say whether it is or isn't a certain way. So she calls this then another form of bad faith, the critic. This person defines themselves in a positive manner by seeking to view existence impartially, without bias, because again, there is no pure objective, there is no given of how the world necessarily must be, and therefore what is objectively beautiful and what is not. But, she says, because of this, then, the critic gets caught up in the trap of the serious by rejecting or not taking as seriously the necessary partial truths of everyday existence and which human engagement does disclose. Because what they end up doing is by thinking, well, I need to be impartial then because there's nothing that's absolutely necessarily correct, then the critic never actually starts to substantially engage in human life and with other beings. And what they end up doing is not disclosing their being genuinely. Now, the active state of this she calls the aesthetic attitude. So the aesthetic attitude is that she says, we note at once that such an attitude appears in moments of discouragement and confusion. In fact, it is a position of withdrawal, a way of fleeing the truth of the present. But the present is not a potential past. It is the moment of choice and action. We cannot avoid living it through a project. And there is no project which is purely contemplative, since one always projects himself towards something, toward the future. To put oneself outside as if we're not really substantially part of the world is still a way of living the inescapable fact that one is inside. So I like this quote here. She says, man never contemplates, he does. And what's happening here with the aesthetic attitude and the critic is that by thinking that, well, again, I don't want to get caught up in seeing this a certain way as if it absolutely can only be seen a certain way, they end up thinking they can have this impartial view then to a thing, which they're not picking a side. But that ends up meaning they pick the kind of impersonal, abstract, and ultimately this godlike view of then how to view things. And that is no different than the serious person or the not the child, but the subman potentially. So let's think about then freedom seriously, because freedom is kind of the process. It is the foundation as much as then the ambiguity of human existence is. Progress then, because if we want to talk about an ethics, we can't just say, well, you do whatever you do, and then it doesn't really matter because there is no such thing as progress as to where you can go one way or another. So you might as well, I guess, do some things over here, and then, oh, that turned out bad. Oh well, go do some other things over there, right? There has to be some concept of progress, a way in which we are going, right? A way to orient ourselves. And for Beauvoir, the way to think about progress is that it's a function of obtaining new horizons upon which to proceed. Which means then there are possibilities for new discoveries, there are new ways of living one's life. So she says on page 79, it is in the light of this assumption that the word progress finds its veridical meaning, the way in which it becomes true. It is not a matter of approaching a fixed limit, absolute knowledge, or the happiness of man, or the perfection of beauty. All human effort would then be doomed to failure, for with each step forward, the horizon recedes a step. For man, it is a matter of pursuing the expansion of his existence, and of retrieving this very effort as an absolute. So think of it, I like, this reminds me a bit of this Oscar Wilde quote in his essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he talks about utopia. And now utopia is that point on a map of which we set this ideal up for, and we set sail, and he says, and then upon getting there, we look out upon the horizon again and sail out for another utopia. That it is an ongoing process, right? That you never actually get there, but you must have utopia to ever begin that voyage in the first place. There are interesting questions about this in regard to, of course, potentially climate change is one way to think about this idea of freedom. Does climate change hurt or deny the fullness, the genuine being of ourselves when it necessarily limits the possibilities of our future, right? That's just something to think about, that a friend of mine actually associated with the Beauvoir's conception of freedom here. But continuing with this, she says, science condemns itself to failure when, yielding to the infatuation of the serious, it aspires to attain being, to contain it, and to possess it. But it finds its truth if it considers itself as a free engagement of thought in the given, aiming at each discovery, not at fusion with the thing, but at the possibility of new discoveries. And so here she's worried that it's possible that science, in the way in which it seeks to quantify everything, that it might then also limit the ways in which we can find meaning in our world by saying, no, does whatever you're doing is it quantifiable? And if it's not quantifiable, well, then it has no value. And so she's finding that science, it's not necessarily bad, but it can limit our freedom by basically playing into the problem of the serious man. And there's something a bit similar that I think it's just slightly after de Beauvoir publishes this, that Martin Heidegger has his famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, where he takes a very similar view towards science, but modern technology in general. And there's a lot to be concerned about, where he talks about, the problem of like human resources, and we talk about human capital, and the way we start to define ourselves in these boxed in terms where everything ends up already kind of what he calls being in standing reserve, that everything is already presupposed to then be something that's quantifiable, or something which is to be profitable or lead to the maximization of profit or something like that, or infinite growth, where like we start to look at the environment as energy, stores of energy. And that is the only then way in which the the environment can be viewed. And in that way, then that is a kind of bad faith, because it limits what de Beauvoir here is saying, the horizons upon which then we can see and we can chart out the ways in which we might desire to live our lives. Now, of course, that the horizon is open-ended, that the possibilities for what we can do in our life are limitless. Almost, actually. There is a caveat we'll see in a moment. This requires for de Beauvoir, and this actually comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, that to genuinely then will oneself free is to really gamble. And what is meant by that is then not to hedge your bets and say, well, these are all the possibilities, and then I think I might want to do these things over here. So then to do those, I must then do steps A, B, and C, which give me the best probability of attaining that end I want. Because what that does then is you don't actually treat yourself as being entirely free, where you can do anything, but instead you start to say, no, well, I must actually do these things or else I'm a failure. So we'll see what she says here about this on 81. She says, the explorer knows that he may be forced to withdraw before arriving at his goal. The scientist, that a certain phenomenon may remain obscure to him. The technician, that his attempt may prove abortive. These withdrawals and errors are another way of disclosing the world. So the reason why to genuinely will yourself free is to make a real gamble where you don't try to hedge your bet so that in some way you're safe, right? But you risk it in whatever it is you want to pursue in life. This is necessary because it's related to the fact that we necessarily will die, right? We are being toward death always. This is inescapable, and that means our choices are much more important, the Beauvoir and the other existentialists would argue, than otherwise would be the case if we weren't necessarily being toward death. Because we can only then do a finite number of things, and that means then our gamble is real. And then when we try to deny that and say, well, no, I don't necessarily have to lose, I can arrange it so that I necessarily end up with one of these, three ends. That then we start to fall back into bad faith and say, well, then again, I must necessarily end up in these three paths in life or else I'm a failure. And there's nothing, again, to go back to one of the suppositions of existentialism, there's nothing that says one is an absolute failure or not, other than to deny, of course, the ambiguity of their existence, which would be, in these cases, of bad faith. Now, that the possibilities are, I said, limitless, and I said, well, actually, that's not quite true. There is a caveat. That caveat is that limiting the freedom of another ends up limiting the freedom of myself. So if I choose to be some kind of a tyrant, or I try to enslave a fellow human being, I don't just deny another their freedom, but while exerting my freedom. In that action, de Beauvoir says, I end up denying my freedom as well. She says, for a freedom wills itself genuinely only by willing itself as an indefinite movement through the freedom of others. As soon as it withdraws into itself, it denies itself on behalf of some object which it prefers to itself. And by that way, then, in one instance, by denying the freedom of someone else to do something other than do what I want, I end up saying here that I must have that object. It is necessary. And then, I no longer treat that other human being as if they're a subject, but now an object to be, treated as me as a subject to, see fit. And in another way of viewing this, by limiting the freedom of others, I also then limit my own freedom because I end up taking out variables in my existence. And by taking out variables, I start to then limit the possibility for my existence. Because that means then I maybe think, well, this is a better kind of life here if people don't do such and such, so therefore I should stop people from doing such and such. And in that way, then I start to set up necessary ends for my existence. Now, of course, a question might arise, though, yeah, but what if someone is trying to enslave you? Is de Beauvoir then saying that I can't stop them from enslaving me because that would then stop the freedom of them to do what they want? So another way of phrasing this is, might stopping another from limiting the freedom of another limit the freedom of myself by denying the oppressor freedom? The Beauvoir says to this, a freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied. So one cannot then be tolerant to intolerance. That one must actually then deny freedom of to be intolerant when it then begins to deny the freedom of others. Now this is a necessary command. So she continues saying, and it is not true that the recognition of the freedom of others limits my own freedom. To be free is not to have the power to do anything you like. It is to be able to surpass the given toward an open future. The existence of others as a freedom defines my situation and is even the condition of my own freedom. I am oppressed if I am thrown into prison, but I am not oppressed if I am kept from throwing my neighbor into prison. So here then, I think we're starting to really kind of see the picture here of existentialist ethics as de Beauvoir is outlining. And why it is then that she calls this the ethics of ambiguity. And here she starts to define then what exactly is meant by ambiguity. And she means that the meaning of existence is never fixed, but instead must be constantly one. That we must then seek these new horizons, these new ways in which to live our lives, to will our freedom, to choose who we want to be and what we want to do. And this is not only a definition, a statement of the case of humanity, it's not only just a description of the way in which human nature is, but it's also a prescription, because it is to say then, we basically embrace our human nature in that it is then ambiguous. It is because man's condition is ambiguous that he seeks, she says, through failure and outrageousness, to save his existence. Now this again might be something that many would have a hard time accepting, and it is then that there is no fixed end, right? There is no, to think of Aristotle here, right, and teleological ethics. De Beauvoir's ethics is not teleological. She is not saying that the cause of our actions is towards some end of which then we eventually fulfill. So remember going back to Aristotle, and he says that the end, of course, is happiness, that all of our actions aim at happiness. De Beauvoir is not saying that, because that would then be to say, well, another end would not be then a correct end, and that would then to be deny the freedom for us to choose whatever end we like, since our condition is ambiguous and never given. So what that means then about freedom, and what it means then to be ethical, if we want to start talking about it this way now, in more direct ethical terms, freedom is only achieved if it genuinely aims itself and not if it achieves its end. That then the ethics of ambiguity is a matter more of process than it is of the result desired. And that doesn't mean, though, I want to make this clear, that does not mean that the consequences of an action are not taken into consideration, because of course they are, and we saw this with the case of limiting the freedom of others. So she says, this requires that each action be considered as a finished form, whose different moments, instead of fleeing toward the future in order to find their justification, reflect and confirm one another so well that there is no longer a sharp separation between present and future, between means and ends. So that the antithesis then of going back to, the rational versus the sentiment, the consequences versus the intention, the means versus the ends, that this is not something then that where you have to choose one over the other, but instead you embrace the ambiguity between the two. So since the liberation aimed at is not a thing situated in an unfamiliar time, but a movement which realizes itself by tending to conquer, it cannot attain itself if it denies itself at the start. Action cannot seek to fulfill itself by means which would destroy its very meaning. And so by then willing our freedom, by willing that we see the horizon upon which the almost limitless paths we could take in life are, we want at the same time achieve our goal, but also start the path on achieving it. So by then undertaking that process, we are achieving the end at the same time. To say there must be an end that we must achieve, which is the primary focus, is then to take away the process, which can only genuinely exist then if the horizon is open, where the process can go anywhere. So the process always going anywhere then is the end itself. So that might seem a bit weird to wrap your head around, but think of it this way. She says that the tyrant is one who is certain in their aims. They are sure of that goal that they must achieve in life, of what they necessarily ought to do, of which then there is no need for deliberation. There is no need to question whether or not what we're doing is the correct thing, because they are sure of it. And it is then when people are certain in their aims that, for de Beauvoir, that is when atrocities occur, because people then no longer begin questioning whether what they're doing is the right thing or not. So, in contrast to that, a person of goodwill then, one who wills their freedom genuinely, remains questioning an ambiguity. They do this by continuing to ask themselves, quote, am I really working for the liberation of men? Isn't this end contested by the sacrifices through which I am at it? In setting up its end, freedom must put them in parentheses, confront them at each moment with that absolute end which it itself constitutes, and contest in its own name the means it uses to win itself. So I am actually only being ethical if I am actively always questioning what it is I choose to do. And when I stop questioning and when I become complacent or satisfied that what I'm doing is the correct thing, that is when I then become the tyrant. And that is when I'm more likely then to do bad things, to hurt other people, and then to deny their freedom. So she says, what makes the problem so complex, and why this is ambiguous, why ethics is ambiguous, is that on the one hand, one must not make himself an accomplice of that flight from freedom that is found in heedlessness, caprice, mania, and passion, and that, on the other hand, it is the abortive movement of man toward being, which is his very existence. It is through the failure which he has assumed that he asserts himself as a freedom. To want to prohibit a man from error is to forbid him to fulfill his own existence. It is to deprive him of life. And so think about the ways in which then we care about certain people, and we, I think this is probably a bit more applicable with children, but it works as well in other cases, but especially with children, the way parents want to ensure that their children do not suffer, that they don't make mistakes, at least especially mistakes that are too big. What de Beauvoir is saying here is you are actually hurting the child because you are denying them the ability for them to choose for themselves what they want to be, who they want to be, what they want to do in life. You end up making the child, not only then are you actually acting in bad faith by denying them that the child also has free will, because then you are taking away their freedom. You also then make the child have bad faith and will their freedom badly because they turn into the case of the child or potentially the subman. So there are things then, I want to make it clear that it's not, what de Beauvoir is arguing here is not something that we could just say is like as entirely subjective ethics. It's not it's not a relativist ethics where relativism, of course, says whatever is relative to you or to a culture is what then is correct. She is saying there are better and worse ways to do things. And the cases of bad faith are the ways in which it is worse, and ultimately then, especially in the cases of bad faith, it is bad. These are things we ought not to do. So there are prescriptions of which then, now you have to decipher these things in the world, because again, de Beauvoir says you cannot have rules that are set that work throughout all time, because to think that you can then derive rules like Immanuel Kant through pure reason, would be then to have bad faith and think that then, well, there are ways that necessarily are correct ways of living universally throughout all time. And to Beauvoir saying, it would say then, that is of course to have bad faith and deny the ambiguity of our condition. So before we get to her conclusion, I do want to look at a few objections. So we'll look at some arguments she makes, and then we'll see some objections to those arguments, and then we'll see her response to those arguments. So the first thing is that if we wanted to have some kind of a precept of existentialism, though, even though I just said, right, it doesn't have rules that are universal, there are still prescriptions. What would be one? She says that if there is a precept, it would be to treat the other as a freedom so that their end may be freedom as well. So it's not to do to the child that parents, I guess naturally want to do. Now, an objection to this could be, well, is this not an a priori designation? Is this not a precept, right, that you need to treat the other as a freedom? Is that not something that is then determined prior to all experience, prior to all existence? And so then would be a case of where you're saying, well, this is objectively what is the correct thing to do? She says to this objection, the fact is that no behavior is ever authorized to begin with. And one of the concrete consequences of existentialist ethics is the rejection of all previous justifications which might be drawn from the civilization, the age, and the culture. It is the rejection of every principle of authority. And in then rejecting every principle of authority, you are then willing the freedom of others such that then they don't actually have anything that is determined for them other than the fact that they are determined to be free to choose what they want to do and not have anything determined. Now, is that contradictory that you can't force someone to be free? And that's probably not a correct way of summing this up. I think it's close. Is that actually contradictory? De Beauvoir doesn't think so. Of course, I'll let you decide about that. Another argument de Beauvoir puts forth is that the method proposed of existentialism consists in confronting the values realized with the values aimed at. So what are the values we are basically thrown into in a society, right? Every society has different values. How do we confront those values? And maybe you can think of the family you grow up in, right? And you have certain family values. How do you confront the family values you grow up with maybe some of the things you start to desire, where you want to go in your life? It is only then in confronting the values realized with the values then aimed at, and we can even think of then, once you begin the journey, you start to realize values because you've undertaken that process. And you don't want to become complacent and then treating those values you've cultivated as the only values that one can have. So it is the confrontation between the two then, the values realized with the values aimed at, so in the future. That is the meaning then of the act with its content. So is not then, here's the objection, is not the ethical concern of genuinely confronting ambiguity detrimental to the interests of the action? Doesn't that actually end up maybe determining how you ought to proceed then in your action and limit then the possibilities? She says to this, an action which wants to serve man ought to be careful not to forget him on the way. So it ought to be careful to remember the ambiguous condition of humanity, and that it's always subject to questioning and ultimately revision, whatever your aim may be. If it chooses to fulfill itself blindly, it will lose its meaning or will take on an unforeseen meaning. For the goal, again, is not fixed once and for all. It is defined all along the road which leads to it. Is existentialist ethics individualistic? She says yes. If one means by that it accords to the individual an absolute value, and that it recognizes in him alone the power of laying the foundations of his own existence. So existentialism is individualistic, and that it does not seek to confine the individual to what is for the greater good, right? It's not a collectivist ethics. But it's also not necessarily individualistic in the sense in which it is solipsistic. So it's more egoistic, we could say. It's not selfish. And so this is the second question on this slide here, or objection. Is existentialist ethics solipsistic, where just, the world revolves around me, I only think of myself? And she says to this, it is not solipsistic, since the individual is defined only by his relationship to the world and to other individuals. That again, this is an embracing of the ambiguity. It's not saying, yes, we are individualistic and not collectivistic, but it is embracing the ambiguity of the individual in relation to then the community and the world in general. And finally, isn't the battle without victory a ruse? Isn't this idea that, well, there is no real end that you must achieve, it's just about the process, undertaking actions to get at some end of which then you will set sail again for new ends and so on. Isn't that kind of a delusion, or at least a lie? You're lying to yourself every time you set forth on some new path in life? And she says to that, this objection can only be formed by placing himself on the grounds of an inhuman and consequently false objectivity. To claim then that, well, isn't this idea that there is no real end of which then you are to achieve, but you're just to set out and achieving limitless ends, isn't that a lie? Well, she's saying, by even asking that question, you have to presuppose then that the only way in which an ethics can be legitimate or true is if then there is some final absolute end. As she says of this, but mankind cannot fool itself completely, since it is precisely mankind which creates the criteria of true and false. That is nothing more than another case of bad faith, where you can't actually deny your freedom, but you can pretend to deny your freedom. You can pretend that there is some real end in your life of which it is necessary you achieve. You can pretend that there is a real right and wrong. And in so doing, you no longer question then your behavior. And in this way, then, you lie to yourself. So, I want to read the conclusion here because, one, I just really like the way it's written, but I also like the idea of summing up, in the own words of the philosopher, the argument here. So this is the last 2 pages of the text, and the Beauvoir writes, this justification, though open upon the entire universe through time and space, will always be finite. And what she's talking about is the... Sorry, I should have prefaced that. What she's talking about is the justification upon which we proceed out into the world to create meaning, which is derived then from our finite existence, and that then our condition is ambiguous. And so she says, whatever one may do, one never realizes anything but a limited work, like existence itself, which tries to establish itself through that work, and which death also limits. It is the assertion of our finiteness, which doubtless gives the doctrine which we have just evoked its austerity and, in some eyes, its sadness. As soon as one considers a system abstractly and theoretically, one puts himself, in effect, on the plane of the universal and thus of the infinite. And again, our lives are not infinite. That is why reading the Hegelian system is so comforting. And, sorry, real quick, Hegel had this idea of this unfolding throughout history of kind of these different ways, progressions throughout human existence, which ultimately aim at the kind of fulfilling and self-realization of spirit or of self-consciousness. And so that we're necessarily then, all of our actions are aimed at some one final end. And so that would then be, she's saying, why the Hegelian system is comforting. I remember having experienced a great feeling of calm on reading Hegel in the impersonal framework of the Bibliothèque Nationale. That's the National Library in France. in August 1940. But once I got into the street again, into my life, out of the system, beneath a real sky. So she's saying once she got out of the academic world into the real kind of concrete existence, the system was no longer of any use to me, that Hegelian system. What it had offered me under a show of the infinite was the consolations of death. And I again wanted to live in the midst of living men. I think that, inversely, existentialism does not offer to the reader the consolation of an abstract evasion. So she's granting here, yes, it is scary that, of course, our choices have real consequences because ultimately, if there is no God, she's saying, we can't have our sins atoned for. They are permanent. They are irrevocable. That means all of our actions, right, carry with them a potentially very heavy burden. And that can be scary, and that can be why then we either, in certain cases, experience existential dread, or more, I think, specifically to this case, why we experience existential angst, anxiety, I think, more generally. Existentialism proposes no evasion. On the contrary, its ethics is experienced in the truth of life, and it then appears as the only proposition of salvation which one can address to men. Taking on its own account, Descartes' revolt against the evil genius, the pride of the thinking reed in the face of the universe which crushes him, it asserts that, despite his limits, through them, it is up to each one to fulfill his existence as an absolute. Regardless of the staggering dimensions of the world about us, the density of our ignorance, the risks of catastrophes to come, right? All these things are possible. And our individual weakness within the immense collectivity. The fact remains that we are absolutely free today if we choose to will our existence in its finiteness, if we accept that our lives are finite. A finiteness which is open on the infinite. Because then, right, remember, our horizons are basically limitless. And in fact, any man who has known real loves, real revolts, real desires, and real will knows quite well that he has no need of any outside guarantee to be sure of his goals. Their certitude comes from his own drive. There is a very old saying which goes, "Do what you must, come what may." That amounts to saying in a different way that the result is not external to the goodwill which fulfills itself in aiming at it. If it came to be that each man did what he must, existence would be saved in each one without there being any need of dreaming of a paradise where all would be reconciled in death. Let me read that last line again. If it came to be that each man did what he must, existence would be saved in each one of us without there being any need of dreaming of a paradise where all would be reconciled in death. And so the argument is then, if there is some assurance that in the end, the wrongs will be righted, justice will be served, our sins will be forgiven, and ultimately there is a necessary way in which we must live our lives, de Beauvoir is actually saying then we would have no dreams because our end would be determined. And you cannot have dreams if your existence is already predetermined where you should go. Dreams only count for de Beauvoir if you actually have the possibility of achieving them, fulfilling your wishes. So the discussion question I thought might be interesting for this, is de Beauvoir correct that an ethics based on objectivity with a definite end to be attained is incoherent? And so, of course, think about what she just said here, ending the text. But I also want to bring back my favorite quote from this book, where she says, one does not offer an ethics to a god. So again, is de Beauvoir correct that an ethics based on objectivity with a definite end to be attained is incoherent?